Welcome to Thinking Green. I'm Rana, and as we wind down our season, we only have 1 or 2 shows left before we go on break for the summer. Tonight's topic is actually something that, among everything we've talked about all year, is sort of closer to me personally than a lot of what we talk about on the show. Tonight's guest is Shelly Altman. He's the co-chair of the Jewish Voice for Peace New Haven chapter. And Jewish Voice for Peace is an organization I've supported for several years, and I think the message is really important. So welcome. I'm glad you could make it on the show.
Thank you, Rana, and I'm so glad to be able to be here and talk about this. I know it's an issue that is on a lot of people's minds, and there's a lot of conflicting opinions about it, and some people have more information than others do, and so it's good to talk about it. First, let me give you a little bit of an overview of what Jewish Voice for Peace is.
I think that's a good idea.
Yeah. So Jewish Voice for Peace is actually a national organization, and I'd like to actually read the mission to everybody, and just so that we have that set, and then we'll talk a little bit more about what kind of work we're doing and so forth. So the mission is Jewish Voice for Peace members are inspired by Jewish tradition to work together for peace, social justice, equality, human rights, respect for international law, and a U.S. foreign policy based on these ideals. Our primary focus as a Jewish organization is working for justice for all of the people in Israel and Palestine, and especially to the end of the occupation, of the Israeli occupation of the West Bank and Gaza. Jewish Voice for Peace has 200,000 supporters, people who've actually donated to the organization. We have 10,000 members, and we have a rabbinical council, academic advisory council, we have a cultural council, student activities in universities. So it's quite broad in terms of the kinds of work that we do in the United States. And so Jewish Voice for Peace also has 60 chapters throughout the country.
And I only found out about the New Haven one maybe a couple of months ago.
Well,
I knew it was a national organization.
Where have you been for the last 2 years?
Living 1 hour away, who knew?
Right. So, and that's actually a good point. We formed our chapter about 2 years ago, actually a little bit over 2 years ago now, and getting going and having people know that we exist and volunteering with us and working with us. Ordinarily, that would be pretty tricky to get an organization going. In our case, unfortunately, it was actually a little bit easier because our chapter formed 2 years before the Israeli invasion and devastation in Gaza, and in July of 2014. And so a lot was going on. We had a lot to act on in terms of press and in terms of outreach to various organizations that were terribly upset by what was going on. And so in some sense it gave us a foothold, although I would have preferred that the foothold happened in a different way.
Yeah, so how did you become involved in Jewish Voice for Peace?
So I'm Jewish, and I grew up in a Jewish household in New York City, and I've been aware of received a Jewish education, was bar mitzvahed, and got a education about Israel and about the founding of Israel in Hebrew school and in Sunday school, and I sort of brought that into my early adulthood, and then gradually over the years I became more and more aware that things weren't quite the way I had learned. And the more I learned, the more painful it was to hear it, and the pain sort of made me stay away from the issue. Until 3 years ago, I decided that it was time to go to Israel and the West Bank and see for myself what was going on and what people were dealing with. And so I joined a delegation with Interfaith Peace Builders, which is an organization that takes people on delegations to Israel and the West Bank. This was in May of 2013. And my eyes were opened.
Probably was pretty shocking.
It was very shocking. And just on the drive from Ben Gurion Airport to Jerusalem, which is where we were staying in East Jerusalem, unprompted really, the word apartheid just jumped out at me. Just seeing how there was different road systems, that you could identify Palestinian villages because there were water towers on the roofs of the houses. The reason being that the water supply to Palestinian population is significantly less than to Israeli population, specifically in the settlements, and I'd like to get into that a little bit later in more detail. So it was shocking, and I think one of the visits that we had lots of meetings and visits to ordinary citizens and advocacy groups, both in Israel and in the West Bank, and we visited the neighborhood of Sheikh Jarrah, which is in East Jerusalem, and it's a neighborhood in which was originally Palestinian population, and gradually the homes are being taken over by Israeli Jews. And what's happening, and the particular home that we visited with a woman whose name was Rivka. She was born in Haifa before 1948. She was part of the population, 750,000 Palestinians who were expelled from Israel, and she ended up in East Jerusalem. And she, with some aid, was able to build this house that she lived in. But 3 years prior to us visiting, half of the house had been, in the middle of the night, the Israeli police showed up with some Russian backpackers, took over half of her house, threw her out, and this happens all the time.
Backpackers? That's very odd.
Right, and put their stuff out on the street. So Rivka was now living in the back half of this house. And we had a talk with our delegation and her and asked her a lot of questions. And at the end we said, what can we do, as America, what can we do to help you with your plight? And she said, her answer was very clear. She said, please go back to America and tell America what kind of suffering these settlements are causing us to have to live through. And that's why I'm here. I'm telling America.
And I, for one, want to hear this because some of the viewers know I lived in Israel from 1969 to 1974. Mm-hmm. My two sons were born there, and a lot of the roots of today's problems were there, but there wasn't a separation wall. It was after the Six-Day War. There was a green line, but it was sort of not really, it was on paper only. All the roads were open. There weren't any superhighways in the West Bank. And at the time, it seemed like the possibilities, there was potential that something really good could come of it. Maybe not even just one possible good option. And I've never gone back since, and I haven't really wanted to see what you saw in 2013, but I want to know anyway.
Yeah, let me tell you a little bit about what I saw, and also let's talk about the separation wall a little bit. So the separation wall it's a good name for it, because what it's doing is separating people from each other. And I know that the Israelis government says that it built the wall to deal with the suicide bombings that were going on. And I don't have any question that it reduced the suicide bombings. I don't think there's any debate about that. Although, things like that are still happening, but far less. And so in theory, the separation wall is to keep Palestinians in the West Bank so they don't come into Israel and do whatever it is the Israeli government thinks they're going to do. In fact, the wall really is multi-purpose. for one thing, it doesn't follow the Green Line. It snakes in and out of Palestinian territory.
And I think it's entirely on the Palestinian side. I don't think it goes into the Israeli side at all, or hardly at all.
I think that's right. I'm not 100% sure, but I think that's right. So you know, what you talk about in terms of the Israeli, Jewish Israeli and Palestinian populations commingling, as it were, is something that doesn't happen anymore. And so the only view of Jews that the Palestinians in the West Bank have are of the IDF, the Israeli Defense Force, the army, which mans the checkpoints or womans the checkpoints, and periodically comes in and is quite violent in its treatment of the Palestinian population. And so the only view of Palestinians that the Jewish Israelis have, well, there's two, really. One is that 20% of the population of Israel is Arab or Palestinian. You can use either term. And that's both Arab Christian and Arab Muslim. So there is some intermixing of Jewish and Palestinian within Israel itself, although it's quite separate. There's a lot of, there are laws that cause there to be more separation than there should be. So the two populations don't know each other as people anymore. They don't know each other as people. They only know each other as the people on the other side of the wall. The other thing that the wall is used for is to grab resource. It's basically the wall snakes around water resource. The wall snakes around land that the Israelis want to lay claim to for settlements. The wall separates Palestinian villages from their orchards, and that's particularly true in, for example, the town of Belin in the West Bank, where there have been very valiant protests at the wall every Friday for years, and about which the movie Five Broken Cameras was made. So the wall really, and in some cases, not only separates villages from the orchards, but it separates villages in half, just, you know. So that's, you know.
Now, going back for a minute to the first thing you mentioned, that the Jewish Israelis and the Palestinians on the West Bank really don't see each other. I wanted to talk a little about the media, because it seems as though if you don't have any firsthand experience of each other as people, you might be really vulnerable to the messages you get via the media.
Yeah, and you know, to be honest, I think the Israeli media, well, I have a lot of things to say about that. The first thing that I was about to say before I cut myself off is that the Israeli media is far more open in how it's reporting on things than the U.S. media. And I want to read to you a little bit about that shortly. So, for example, the newspaper Haaretz, that's one of my primary sources of information of what's happening in Israel and in the West Bank, because it's very honest, balanced, factual reporting. For example, there's the Israelis over the last few weeks cut off water supply to the West Bank in large amount, and Haaretz had a really good article about that yesterday in terms of why the Israelis say they're doing it and the Palestinian response to that. There's nothing about that in the U.S. press. Meanwhile, you know, the towns and villages and agricultural land in the West Bank is without water.
And of course, being in Connecticut right now, this month has been dry, but it hasn't really been hot.
Right.
June in Israel, it doesn't rain from May until early October or late September.
You know that better than I do.
I do, and where we ultimately lived every so often, because it was really the forests of Lebanon geographically, we did occasionally see like a 5-minute rainstorm in summer. But in most of the country and most of the West Bank, it really doesn't rain for 6 months of the year. So if you don't have access to water for irrigation, you're really in trouble.
So let me talk about that a little bit further. So the West Bank is actually rich in water in terms of the aquifer, the Jordan River Valley, and it's one of the reasons that the Israelis are very loath to give up any control of the land, because the best water resource in the area between the Mediterranean and the Jordan River is in the West Bank. As part of the Oslo Accords in 1993, the Israelis were given access to, I believe, 71% of the water resource from the aquifer in the West Bank, and the Palestinians were given 19%. That agreement was supposed to last for 5 years until things got worked out on a more equitable basis, but now we're 20 plus years later, and nothing has changed. The other thing is that the settlements that had been built in the West Bank, which now number, I think, over 500,000 Israelis, wow. Jewish Israelis, the settlements are water intensive in their use. They have swimming pools. It's Western civilization using water as if there's no end in sight. Whereas in the rest of the West Bank, in the Palestinian cities and towns and villages in the West Bank, the water resource is restricted, water is cut off. The average Palestinian uses 1/7 of the amount of water per capita that the wow. average settlement dweller uses. I'm not sure if that moves over into Israel as well, but definitely within the settlements, that's the figure that has been established.
I know I used to think of settlements as being like little, like I lived on a small kibbutz, and I would think the settlements would be kind of like that. But if you look at photos of the settlements now, they're cities.
Bernie Sanders would say they're huge. And I'm laughing, but it's pretty painful. When I was there in 2013, we visited a farm that's called Tent of Nations, and it's a farm that's owned by the Nasser family, several generations of the Nasser family who are Palestinian, and their family has got title to the land from the Ottoman Empire in 1919, and their farm overlooks some of the settlements, and so you're on this farm, and the settlements are like huge cities, high rises. You really are looking out at a huge city, and that's not atypical. That is primarily what the settlements are like. And in this particular case, the Israelis have been trying at that time for over 20 years to remove the Nasser family from their farm. And it's really, you look at it and it's an individual circumstance, but if you look at what the overall, the reason that they're doing it and the historical connection to what they're doing, they have been trying to reduce the Palestinian population and acquire the land, grab the land in whatever way they can since before the State of Israel was created in 1948. And so whether it be a land grab, like in this case, where they're trying to prove that this family shouldn't stay on the land anymore, or other cases where they're building settlements on land that has been seized, or the home demolitions, which we can get into later, every one of these is another facet of an attempt to get more land and reduce non-Jewish population in the area between the Mediterranean and the Jordan River. And we can talk about what that means in human terms, in ethical terms. That's sort of a separate issue. But in terms of why they're doing that kind of thing, that it's been going on for a long time.
So you had mentioned before, and when I lived in Israel, I have to say I was pretty blissfully unaware of what was happening in the 1940s and 50s. At that time, I thought everything was kosher. It wasn't. Now, you had mentioned something about the greening of Israel, which seems part and parcel with the displacement of Palestinian residences and the Jewish National Fund's role in that. Do you want to talk about that a little?
Yeah, let me talk about that a little bit. So, I mean, there's several ways to come at this, but there's a phrase of, maybe you can help me with this, I might space out on it, but there was a phrase that Israel was a land without people for a people with no land. That's,
yeah.
Is that the right?
It's something like that.
Something like that. So that's a problem because it wasn't a land without people. There were people living there. And when the Zionist movement started in the late 19th century, and in response to the oppression of Jews in Europe, in Eastern Europe, and Russia, there was a lot of debate about where Jews should migrate to, about whether they should be migrating, about if they did migrate, was it just to escape the oppression or was it to create a state? There was lots of robust discussion for many, many years over those issues, and there are discussions that are still happening to this very day. And so Jews started moving into, gradually migrating into what's now Israel and Palestine. And the Zionist movement felt that it needed to have a Jewish majority in the land in order to establish a Jewish homeland. That was one aspect of Zionism. So, do you have a question?
Well, no, it seems to me that when the original borders were formed by the mandate,
yeah.
They went town by town, and depending on the majority population, that's what side they determined it was on.
So here's where I'm going with this, because I know you asked about greening.
Yeah.
So in 1948, after the British left, the British sort of abandoned, and that's part of the problem. That's part of a cause for the problem, in that it was essentially anarchy. It's kind of a situation where there's no governing authority. And so the people who were there, whoever was there and whoever had inclination to become the governing authority, started to act. And because the Zionist movement was so strong at that point, but because there hadn't been enough Jewish immigration into it, they decided that the only way to have a majority Jewish population was to expel Palestinians. And so in 1948, 1947, 48, 49, about 750,000 Palestinians were expelled from over 500 villages in the area that we now call Israel and the West Bank. One of those villages was Lubya. And I think Lubya is in the Galilee.
Yeah, I looked it up on the map. It's a little bit west of the Sea of Galilee.
Yeah, okay. So Lubya was one of the villages that was invaded by, I'm not sure if it was by the Irgun or by the Haganah, or both working in conjunction with each other. Maybe a little bit of the Stern Gang thrown in to terrorize the people in advance to force them to leave before the armed forces came in. So the village of Lubya was leveled. And in fact, on my birthday, there was a truce, a temporary truce, to where the Zionist forces could not invade any more villages and expel Palestinians. So what they did instead on the truce on my birthday was they started to level the villages that they had already expelled people from, because there was nothing in the truce about leveling villages. It was only about invading them and expelling the population. So the Jewish National Fund, which has been active in the area for practically the entire Zionist movement, with a focus on acquiring land, also it has this aspect to it where it plants forests in Israel. And
everyone wanted to
plant a tree in Israel. And so one of the places that the trees were planted was on the remains of the village of Lubya, and the intention was to not only obliterate the village, but to make believe it never happened. So now you have a nice forest, It's greening, it's making the desert bloom, it's having recreational area. It's lovely, but it's obliterating and trying to deny the fact that a Palestinian village was there. The forest that was planted in Lubia was called the South Africa Forest because it was funded by donations from South African Jews who put their quarters in whatever South African currency, the rand, I think, into these blue cans. I think we had them in where I grew up.
I think we had them too.
And those donations were used to plant this forest. The South African folks who did this in their childhood and their young adulthood found out about this a few years ago, partly with the help of an organization in Israel called Zokrot, which is in Hebrew means remember, remembering. And Zokrot's mission is to help Israelis come to grips with the fact that this expulsion, or the Nakba, as the Palestinians call it, which in Arabic means catastrophe, that this happened and it can't be undone, but it can be understood, it can be, the emotions that are around it can be dealt with. So the South Africans found out about this forest having been planted, and they came on a delegation to Israel in 2015, I think, or maybe 14, and essentially apologized to the remaining Palestinians who had lived in this village of Lubia, and had sort of a coming together of South African Jew and Palestinian refugee from Lubia.
So there are ways that we can start maybe working on the damage.
So, one thing I would say about that is, I was at a synagogue a few weeks ago. It was a lovely service. The bat mitzvah girl came up. She was going to be bat mitzvah the following day, and one of the gifts that the synagogue gave her was the planting of a tree in Israel. And I think it's important for Jews who are planting trees in Israel to know where they're planting them and to understand that it may not be what you think it is. And I'm not saying you shouldn't plant trees. You're from the Green Party, so I would never say that to you. But it's more complicated.
Yeah, a lot more complicated. And that's something I knew nothing about, the trees being planted on the remains of villages. Now you mentioned a couple of times demolition of homes and demolition of villages, and the villages ties in with the tree planting. But what's happening with home demolitions? I have to say that Jeff Halper, when he came to, he's the founder of the organization Israeli Committee Against House Demolitions. He was in Connecticut in 2003 or 4 a couple times.
He was also here more recently, a year or two ago.
Yeah, he was. And I went to his two presentations he gave in southeastern Connecticut the first time. And it was pretty shocking. And his focus was house demolitions.
Right. So let me talk a little bit about home demolitions. And once again, it's a continuation of policy and intent that has been going on for a long time in Israel, even before the creation of the state. It's really a human rights issue, an equal rights issue. There are several reasons why homes are demolished, but primarily, by the way, there are over 10,000 home demolition orders outstanding in the West Bank as we speak. In 2014, over 1,000 Palestinian homes were demolished. Sometimes the homes are demolished. The Israelis tend to jump in and demolish homes as a reaction to when there are stabbings or shootings or that kind of thing. And I want to get to that as well. But far more often, it's an administrative thing. And it's administrative in the sense that the West Bank is divided into 3 sections administratively. They're called areas A, B, and C. Area A is under Palestinian control, both security and administration. The only parts of the West Bank that are in Area A tend to be the large cities like Ramallah and maybe Nablus and so forth. Area B, the Israelis have control of security, the Palestinians have administration. And Area C, which is a huge area of the West Bank, the Israelis actually have administration and security responsibility. In order to do building in Area C, you have to get a permit to extend a house, to build a house. It's almost impossible to get a building permit. As population grows, Palestinian families have to have space for their growing families, and so they are between a rock and a hard place, and they build anyway. And that's one huge part of these 10,000 orders that are out for demolition. They'll come with bulldozers in the middle of the night, typically. They'll give the family 15 minutes warning to get their stuff out, and they'll destroy the home. Palestinian children are known to bring their most treasured possessions to school with them because they're afraid when they come home their home's not going to be there anymore, and so it's not just a home demolition thing. It's a psyche demolition thing as well. To feel that you're constantly under that type of pressure. There's one other thing I wanted to say about the home demolitions, which is the demolitions that are done in response to crime, in response to shootings, stabbings, whatever. Number one, they tend to do it to an entire family. They perform collective punishment on entire communities, so that the community in which the 2 guys who committed that horrific shooting in Tel Aviv, Israel is basically intending to barricade and basically destroy the community. That's collective punishment. That's against international law.
And honestly, as a Jew who is of Ashkenazi, descent, you think that one thing we'd have learned from the Holocaust is the collective punishment is not the right path?
Right. And I mean, and as a Jew, I look at it and I say, what's Jewish about that? That has nothing to do with Judaism. Most of what the Israeli government is doing, in fact, right now, I would say has nothing whatever to do with Judaism as far as I'm concerned. But that's a personal opinion.
Yeah, I tend to concur. It certainly isn't what I relate to as being the essence of Judaism.
And let me make one other point about equal rights, which is Israeli Jews commit atrocious crimes too. It's not just limited to the Palestinian population, and I have never heard of, and I could be wrong, but I have never heard of an Israeli Jewish home being demolished. For example, in the last couple of years, there were 2 horrific crimes. One of them was a Palestinian boy named Mohammed Abu Kader was kidnapped in East Jerusalem, was burned to death by 3 Israeli Jews, and they were eventually brought to justice to some degree by the Israeli court system, but their houses were never demolished. Last year, in the town of Duma, there was the Dawabsha family, father, mother, 18-month-old child were burned to death by a firebombing of a home. Once again, no retribution or collective punishment to Jews just because they committed that crime against the Palestinians. So this equal rights thing goes down some interesting paths, and that's one of them.
And there are a few settlements that were founded by people who were like followers of Mayor Kahana, and there's a lot of criminal activity that comes out of them in terms of destroying Palestinian farmers' olive groves.
Yeah, the farm that I mentioned before, the Tent of Nations, had hundreds, maybe thousands, I'm not sure, at least in the many hundreds of olive and fruit trees torn up sometime within the last 2 years by settlers.
And olive trees, people might not know this, the orchards are really old. Olive trees live a long time. Mm-hmm. So these are orchards that are hundreds of years old, perhaps, that are just being destroyed.
Right.
Now, I guess let's talk a little bit about different things that people can do. And BDS, Boycott, Divest, Sanction, is one thing that's been in the news lately with some controversy. Maybe talk a little bit about that.
Right. So BDS is a global grassroots movement for justice for Palestinians. It was formed, it stands on the shoulders of the U.S. Civil Rights Movement, of the boycott of South African apartheid, of the grape boycott in California by the farm workers. It's a justice movement. It was formed back in 2005 by over 170 organizations from Palestinian civil society, ranging from professional groups, to educators, women's groups, businesses, labor unions, really the whole gamut of Palestinian civil society. And the reason it was formed was because the Palestinians came to the conclusion that they needed to have some international intervention and support to force Israel to essentially level the playing field, because there didn't seem to be any other avenue open to them to do it. Israel has a pretty strong patron here in the United States, and
pretty uncritical.
And pretty uncritical. So let me tell you what BDS actually says. There's really three simple parts to it, really, or maybe not so simple. The first goal of BDS is to end the Israeli occupation of the West Bank and Gaza. The second is to have equal rights for the Palestinian citizens of Israel, who I mentioned before number about 20%, which is about 1.4 million people who are of Arab descent in Israel proper. And the third is to recognize and implement the right of return for Palestinians who were displaced and expelled in 1948, or arrange for just compensation. The BDS movement has been quite effective in Europe for a number of years, and in the last 2, 3, 4 years in the U.S. it has gained tremendous strength as people have begun to become aware of what it is and of what it's trying to accomplish, and have become aware of how effective it can be. Some of the examples of successes that the movement has had lately have been in terms of getting businesses that were working that were doing business in the settlements in the West Bank. The SodaStream has left. G4S, which is a global security company. I think they're based in the UK, and G4S recently, and they were managing the Israeli, or at least participating in the management of the Israeli prisons, and prison system in which Palestinians are imprisoned without charge for long periods of time, in administrative detention with no charge, children being imprisoned without having access to their parents. There's all sorts of abuses that we don't have time to go into there, but G4S was getting a lot of pressure globally, and they have now pulled out of Israel. In the last couple of years, several faith communities, the Presbyterian Church in the U.S. divested of Motorola and Hewlett-Packard and Caterpillar, and I can get to Motorola and Hewlett-Packard for managing security systems and systems that were used at the checkpoints and systems that were used for security in the settlements, which are illegal, and Caterpillar because they're frequently used in the home demolitions. The United Church of Christ had a somewhat similar divestment last year.
So, and more recently, Airbnb has been in the news.
Yeah, Airbnb is an interesting case. So, with Airbnb, they have been listing homes, properties, and Airbnb is for vacation rentals in the settlements in the West Bank. So the Palestinians who live a few miles away, their movement is completely restricted, even within the West Bank itself, not even just going into Israel, but there are over 500 checkpoints and barriers within the West Bank itself through which people have to pass all the time. And we at Jewish Voice for Peace, as well as other organizations, particularly around the country, Code Pink, want Airbnb to stop listing in the settlements. And we had an action a couple of weeks ago in which we delivered a petition that had over 150,000 signatures, and we delivered them to Fidelity Investments. And the reason we delivered to Fidelity Investments is because Airbnb is a privately held business, and Fidelity Investments is a primary investor in Airbnb. And so trying to hit both of them, Airbnb was not being responsive to our request, our trying to make them aware of this and trying to help them deal with it. They're just saying, we don't get into politics, and we're saying this isn't politics. This is human rights. This is equal rights, and you really need to do something about it.
And there has been something of a backlash. I mean, even our relatively liberal Senator Blumenthal, and we see in New York State, have been a lot of attempts in the United States to make BDS illegal.
I think the backlash and the pushback shows the growing power of the movement, because they wouldn't be spending their time doing it if it weren't for that, and that's happening in Israel as well. So let me talk about two of those. One is the attempts to stifle this shows how out of touch they are with what's going on, because it's growing, it's getting stronger, and in fact I think the fact that they're trying to stifle it is just going to make it get stronger. We've had expressions of support for example, from the American Civil Liberties Union let me back up for 1 minute for viewers who aren't familiar with it, but there's two things that are going on with the backlash. One is attempts to pass legislation within the states and also within the Congress, U.S. Congress, to penalize organizations and businesses and individuals who advocate for BDS. The second is that in New York State, 2 weeks ago, Governor Cuomo because the New York State legislature had considered passing such legislation and had decided not to do it in response to a reaction from New York State citizens. Governor Cuomo decided he was going to go ahead and issue this executive order, essentially creating a blacklist of businesses and organizations that are supportive of BDS. The problem with this is that, there's a lot of problems with it. For one thing, I think it would eventually be ruled unconstitutional.
You can't really tell people where to put their money.
It's an expression of free speech. the very reason the First Amendment allows for free speech is for political activism. And so that's what this is. And in this case, it's activism in support of human rights and equal rights, and against violence, the violence that's being perpetrated against millions of people in the West Bank and in Gaza. So, so I think that it's interesting that because a couple of months before Governor Cuomo issued this executive order, New York State announced that it was going to boycott North Carolina because of the same-sex bathroom law that got passed there. So it's not that he opposes boycott, and boycott has been used, as I said before, in South Africa. In fact, his own father, Mario Cuomo, I think would be pretty upset if he were still alive. He, in the 1980s, when the New York State was considering boycotting South Africa, and he had problems with the controller because the controller of New York State was creating problems with the state itself, divesting or boycotting. Mario Cuomo himself divested from companies that were doing business in South Africa.
Okay, now the bad news is we're down to our last 4 minutes. So I want to very quickly maybe go through the slides in 2 minutes, talking about what JVP New Haven has been involved in.
Okay, sure. So, so what we're looking at now is, and then I also do want to say, if I can squeeze it in, let's leave a minute for what people should be doing.
Yeah.
So in December, we had what we call our Hanukkah action, in which for 2 nights we held signs, anti-Islamophobia signs, in solidarity with our Muslim community in New Haven and around Connecticut. We had people from all different community groups within New Haven. We held these signs with the candles. We lit the Hanukkah menorah. We sang Hanukkah songs. We had people come by in the street who were so happy that we were doing it. Muslim people who were so happy that Jews were standing there in solidarity with them.
And let's just go through these quickly.
Yeah.
Boycott. We didn't really get to talk
Yeah,
about
we didn't
this
get to
school,
talk about
but,
that. Maybe next time.
Yeah, you'll have to come back.
Right. Yeah. So these are all from our Hanukkah action on New Haven Green. Yeah, let's stay with this one. This isn't from New Haven, but this is when Palestinians use violence, we condemn them. When they use nonviolence, we blacklist them. How should they resist the occupation? What would you do if you were living under occupation for 50 years, with military law for 50 years? How would you like it? How would you feel if your entire life was spent, you weren't able to travel freely?
So we have to give up the computer now, but and the slides. So we can talk for like the last 2 minutes what people can do to help and be supportive.
So people frequently say, well, how can we support folks in Israel? And I think, and in Palestine, actually in both, because there are some groups in Israel who are doing good work.
And I think people there actually, some of them realize that their fates are intertwined.
Right. The U.S. government and the U.S. Jewish population are the greatest enablers of Israel. The U.S. gives Israel currently $3 billion of military aid every year. It's about to go up to at least $4 million, although Netanyahu and his racist defense minister, Avigdor Lieberman, are trying to get $5 billion a year. So the best thing that Americans can do, and especially American Jews, is to raise these issues with each other, to talk about it, to read about it. I suggest reading a book called The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine by the Israeli Jewish historian, whose name I'm spacing out, Ilan Pappé, sorry. That's a good place to start. And really, don't allow yourselves to be silenced anymore, and don't be afraid to go where you've been afraid to go before, where it's been too painful to go before. American Jews have to be supportive of the rights of everybody in Israel and Palestine. And the way to do it is to do it here. And Israel gets the message. They've gotten the message from BDS, and they'll get the message when they see the American government and American Jews in particular questioning and expressing themselves, their opposition to how Israel conducts its affairs.
Well, we're out of time. Thank you so much for coming, Shelly. We'll have to do a follow-up show come fall.
Okay.
And to everyone out there, we'll be back next week.
Okay, and don't forget to visit www.jvpnh.org.
Thank you. Good night.